This video is for the Cadillac 472-500. I'm going to talk today about building headers. There are headers available for Cadillac. Cadco has 5 or 6 types. You can buy drop-in headers now from Sanderson too. There's A-body headers. There's headers for direct drop-in on the Cadillac body. There's headers for trucks. There's kind of a universal header. There's the street rod header we talked about. So there are some headers available these days. If you can't make that happen, or you're thinking, I need to make it a little cheaper, then you wind up building a header. Now, I need to make headers for my car because I've got the motor sitting a little low. It is an A-body. There are headers. I do own a set of the Sanderson A-body headers, and they don't fit. And part of that's my doing. I have the motor mounted lower than most, but I like it there. I like how the car does. I like the extra hood clearance, so I want to leave it there. So I'm going to make headers. Now, these are big block Chevy Super Comp headers. I want to go up. My original header that I built in the 80s was 1.75 inches. These are 2-inch, and they have a 3.5-inch collector. And I think that suits better with the 4-inch exhaust that the car has. So I need to make new headers. I mean, the headers I had still work, but I did them in the 80s. I was young. They're not the best piece, and they've got a lot of age on them at this point. So new headers it is. Now, what I've done here is cut the flange and drill the bolts for the Caddy bolt hole. This is still the big block Chevy flange, but I had to separate it because the Cadillac has a larger center to center distance on the bores than the big block Chevy does. So from tube to tube, you've got to gain about 160 thousandths of an inch. And as you go all the way down the header, that basically equates to a 1/2 inch from end to end that you've got to spread the header out. So in order to do that, like I said, I drilled the holes, and I wasn't real precise. I'm not planning on running it this way. All I'm trying to do is get the tubes spread out and see if they'll fit okay. And they look like they're doing just fine. So at this point, I'm going to take a very hot torch and I'm going to heat up the tubes and see if I can take the stress out. To get them sitting here, I had to pry and pull and fight them, and they're under stress. If I take all the bolts out, then it'll just go back to being a big block Chevy header. So with a couple of heat cycles, especially at the bends, I'm hoping to get it to the point where I don't have to fight it as much when I go to put it on the flange. I also want to try these in the car, and I don't want to be fighting the bolt holes a lot in order to see if the header just kind of fits. So I'm starting at this point just to see if I can get some of the stress out and get them to stay put where they kind of line up with a Cadillac exhaust port. Now this particular set is Super Comp, so it has a square flange. You got to remember, on most big block headers, it's round, and so you wind up having to make it square to boot. This one is technically the right size and the right shape for the Cadillac port, but I still don't think it's a good idea to run it this way, the way I've drilled it. I suppose you could get away with it, but you're asking a lot. So like I said, I'm planning on putting a flange on it. Now, on the other side, I have a problem. One of the things about Cadillac, we talked about the fact that the bore center is different, but the other thing that you have to realize is that the head is offset differently. On a Cadillac, the passenger side head is furthest forward. On a big block Chevy, the driver's side head is furthest forward. So this is called bank offset. And with an opposite bank offset, that messes up how the header fits the car. So it's on the passenger side here, it's really shoving the header way forward. And I have trouble with this tube probably hitting the cross member. I need at least 7 inches in here. And if this is all the way forward on the port here, I don't have that. So what I've done is move it back 1 port. Now this wasn't my idea. This was Cycle Bob's idea for the street rod header. And there's a link in my subscription for this channel that goes to his page. But it's a good idea. It moves the header back to where the collectors are even, and basically all I have to do is make 1 tube. And I think I can just cut it here and put a 45 in and run a tube across the top and go back in using this little bend. And so basically I only have to make one tube and put the flange on the headers. But I'm going to try and test fit it in the car and make sure there's no other obstacles. You know, the Caddy is also wider than a big block Chevy by just a little bit. So if I'm up against the frame here, then I might have to just slightly tilt the header in a bit towards the block to gain a little bit of clearance down there. And that's what I got to look at when I go to try and put it on the car. But just like the other side, on these 3 tubes, I'm going to heat them up and see if I can take the stress out of them so that it'll bolt up easier in the car itself, and I can get a feel for whether I'm too wide, if I'm sitting okay, if I'm hitting the bell housing, if I'm hitting the frame, whatever. I mean, there's a lot of trial and error and work in this. And that's the other thing. I mean, if there are headers available for your particular application, it might really be cost effective to just buy them, even if they're expensive. You know, this particular set of headers cost me $200. And then I've got $100 in the flange. So I've got $300 into trying to make these headers so far. I'm going to have to buy a couple of U-bends. You know, I've got welding, I've got work, you know, so I'm going to have some into it by the time I get done. And sometimes that's not always justified. Now, in my case, I don't feel like I have a choice. But for some of you guys, there are headers that drop in, and a little bit of extra expense might be a lot less grief than trying to go this way and get the header for half price. So that's up to you. The other thing I want to talk about, I mean, the original headers that I made back in the 80s. I was young. They were just basic headmen, 1 3/4 inch. I'm using them on the run stand now. But if you look here real close, I had to extend a tube to make up that 1/2 inch. I could not at the time get them to spread enough to weld them to the flange. Now the other thing is I had to make a better flange. The flanges I bought from CMD back in the day, this was back in the 80s, were flame cut, and they had a little slot right here to the bolt hole. And that slot made, as I welded it, made the whole thing warp. And so when you're looking at flanges, make sure the bolt holes are just regular holes and not slotted. I mean, that was because they were flame cut at the time. But you don't want that because you need the flange to be solid, thick, you know, if you can, and something you can work with without a lot of trouble. So, like I said, these headers have seen better days, but they've got life on my run stand, and I'll make new ones for the car. So the next thing I want to bring up in making headers is the fact that this is a Ford header. FE, or no, 460 Ford. Now you can see the port is kind of oval shaped, but one of the interesting things, and I've actually had these bolted to a motor before, is the bolt pattern is the same as Cadillac. And the port isn't a fantastic match, but you could probably live with that. So I think these would probably just bolt right up. And like I said, they're meant for 460. Now there are some 460s that have the square port, later model fuel injected. But the other thing you got to remember is a 460 is 4.9 inches from bore center to bore center. The Cadillac is 5 inches from bore center to bore center. So you still have to spread this just a little bit, about 3/8 of an inch from end to end. And so if it's got a solid flange, which these did not, you're going to have to cut the flange because you're going to have to spread it just a little bit. But if you're really on a budget and you can find a good deal on a 460 header that looks like it'll fit what you're doing, this is a possibility. You know, it just gives you another option to look at. And I was truly surprised that the bolt pattern was the same. I've heard stories that the 460 was designed by the same guy. Some days I really believe that. So, like I said, it's just something else to think about and a little interesting tidbit of information about what else fits. Now, this is going to take me a while. I'm not going to do it all in this video. It's going to be some work. So I'll do some work and then probably post another short video. I might even show how they fit in the car and if there's anything else I've got to do and, you know, some finish work. But I can't do it all on camera. So that's going to be it for this particular one. This is the start of making headers and making it work for the Cadillac, going into Monte Carlo, and we'll talk to you later. Bye.